Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Glasgow City Halls. I'm Svend Brown. I'm the artistic director of the halls here in Glasgow. And I hope I don't even need to introduce, after all the press coverage that we've been enjoying since, it seems,
too long.
Robin Ticciati, who of course makes his debut tonight as the SCO's principal conductor. And what we're going to do this evening is we're going to talk for about 15 minutes or so, and then if I can see through the blinding lights that are trained upon us, we'll have about 5–10 minutes for questions as well. So in the time-honoured fashion, just raise your hand and leap in. But what I wanted to start talking about right away, Robin, was the music, because of the way that your appointment came about. It was a very, very swift process, wasn't it? And then suddenly, in your very, very busy diary, there was a need to find time so that you could spend enough time with the orchestra in this season. So these periods have been opened up. And I know that you love programming, and because you are coming with concerts placed quite close together in this first season, I mean this week and next week, for example, that must have opened up all sorts of opportunities for you to think about the kind of things you could do with this lot that would go beyond just a single concert into kind of little units of concerts.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when you're faced with 8 or 9 weeks to program, I mean, then you can start to think about certain cycles or, you know, various avenues. But this season I have only 5 weeks with the orchestra, and we haven't worked a lot together. We've done 2 Highland tours, but I just really wanted to, as a basis, to open out, you know, a Mozart, a Beethoven, a Brahms, a Haydn as the kind of basis, and see where they are with that repertoire, see where I am with them in that repertoire. And around that, to sort of wind our way through different repertoire, and also based on the soloists. And, you know, for example, the program tonight, you know, it started the seed. We were able to find Henze and Kožená to come and sing. So, you know, that's where we began the thought of the program. We think, well, what on earth can we do here? And the idea of the Wunderhorn came up, and, you know, there's such, you know, of course it's done by symphonic orchestras as well, but the writing is so chamber. All these, you know, individual woodwind lines, and this sort of all these different colors, and it's amazing to try and find this Viennese style with a chamber orchestra that can dance in a way that they would dance in a Mozart minuet or something. And so, you know, around programming that, we just, you know, I thought that I would love, actually, because we're here and in Usher Hall, to program a Brahms symphony and sort of concentrate on that Central European tradition. And so we have, you know, the orchestra adds 1 more desk of strings for a program with Brahms. And then hopefully the Henze, I don't know, I think the orchestra played it, someone was telling me today in the lift, 25 years ago. So I think it's worth another visit. And this is just a wonderful early work by Henze, and he revised it many times, and I think it meant a lot to him, the piece. And actually, what's interesting, I hope you'll find tonight, but the sort of individual lines of the Henze, and this almost Webern-like quality of the opening movement, and sort of Stravinsky at the end and Debussy in the middle. I mean, there are so many influences, but hopefully that sort of leads you into the Mahler and the kind of sound world that we have there. So that's just kind of one idea of how one goes about, or how I like to think about programming, about what you're going to hear, and the journey that we're going to take you on through an evening.
But before we leave the Henze, can we just talk a wee bit more about it? Because there's absolutely no doubt that it's going to be the piece that's least familiar to not just an audience here in Glasgow, but actually pretty widely. It's not that often performed, is it? How did you, what's your story with it? How did you come across it, and how was your passion for it born?
Well, I've never done, this is my first bit of Henze, and I was just, you know, I was rooting around. I just wanted to find, I'm always, you know, you always want to find pieces, you know, there are always the Dvořáks and the Mozarts and everything that we know, and I thought it was very important for my first weeks here, or my first week also, to sort of set a flavor and a color of, I think, who I am as a person, and what I want to explore with the orchestra. So that was the premise, that was the beginning. And then, you know, of course I've heard a lot of Henze, and I like the works, but generally they're for kind of, you know, 15 symphony orchestras joined together, and, you know, 5 tam-tams and offstage brass. And then I came across this, you know, this collection of small pieces that he's written for chamber orchestras and exercises as well. And And I thought, well, this is perfect. I mean, interestingly enough, this can be done by a large orchestra, this piece that you'll hear tonight. Does anyone, I'm just be so interested if anyone knows it.
No.
There's one person, God, that you see, wow, well, brilliant. And I suppose the wonderful thing is, you can go, what I really want, I suppose what every conductor and every programmer wants to do is to instill a feeling of, well, you can walk away and say, well, I didn't really like that. But that's wonderful, to kind of have those feelings of whether you like something or you don't like something. So, yeah.
As he's got older, Henze has become more and more preoccupied by orchestral colour for its own sake, almost. And he is an absolutely magisterially wonderful handler of orchestral colour. In this early piece, how important is colour and how important is argument, say, or are they equally balanced?
Well, he goes through a whole series of colours with the orchestra. That's what's wonderful. It starts, with sort of a pizzicato, is solo timpani notes and, odd notes on the harp and celeste, and gradually sort of sounds emerge. And this is this Webern quality of individual lines sort of having to be sewn together, and that creates a very electric colour. And then in the middle of it, there's just this sort of wall of sound from, crying brass and sustained strings, and he's gone into something, completely else in the world. And then it's really the second movement that it would take certainly me for a very different place. It's this notturno, a lento, and it starts off with these wind chorales. It's interesting. It's not two flutes, two oboes. It's a contraflute, flute, oboe, cor anglais, and clarinet and bass clarinet. So you have all solo, effectively solo wind players, two horns and two trumpets. And so you have this kind of chorale for the winds, and then the strings make a comment, and then we enter into this incredible world of just pizzicato, just walking pizzicato, and there's this. It feels like some chorale or rite of passage for something where these trumpets and horns have this chorale that moves very, very slowly, and it's an amazing effect. And so that's one type of colour, another type of colour, and the last movement is just kind of Stravinsky on speed or something, whatever it is. I mean, it's really fast and very hard.
Because Henze was writing the piece at a time when it was very complicated to be German, and it was very complicated for him to be German. He himself was intensely conflicted after World War II about his status, his national status, but also as an heir to a great tradition. He's a composer who's very aware of tradition and history in everything he does. And yet all the influences that you've cited there, Stravinsky, Debussy and so on, are non-Germans, apart from Webern, I guess. Putting it cheek by jowl.
I'm not an academic at all, so I mean, those are just my thoughts, and they could be completely wrong with the books. That's the only thing.
Well, you're at the coalface. But I was just fascinated by putting it cheek by jowl with the Brahms, which is the German tradition at its most secure, it's its most founded, if you like. That must make a kind of fascinating juxtaposition for you and for the orchestra.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, it's in the second half to start with the Brahms. In the second half, this piece is so huge. I mean, you can feel the weight of history in it. His struggle with the idea of the symphony, what a symphony is. I mean, Henze, it's called a chamber symphony, but you don't really get the feeling of struggle. I don't quite get the feeling that when Henze wrote it, it was, God, this is number one, quite. But with Brahms, of course, we know, the history of the first symphony it turns into the piano concerto. No, it was the piano concerto. Turns into the first piano concerto. But with the second symphony, it's just, there is this huge history with it, and it's his relationship with Beethoven and fate, and then looking forward. And I think that's what's so interesting doing Brahms with this orchestra. I mean, this is the first journey for me with them in the Brahms, but is their response to classical, the language of classicism of Mozart, Beethoven, Haydn is so strong, and of course Brahms was so influenced by Palestrina, Fuchs, and he had the facsimile of Mozart 40 on his bedside, and so I hope we can bring that to it. And also Brahms was the progressive, that that famous Schoenberg essay, you know, when looking forward to Wagner and everything else that came. And so he sits somehow right in the middle for me, and I do hope. It's the beginning of a big journey, so I'm not going to say we will, but I hope that we give you both those colours tonight, that sense of history, but also that sense of progression in the writing.
I just want to close talking about tonight's programme by focusing a little bit on the Mahler songs, just because it seems to me that perhaps they present a conductor a very, very different challenge from either of the symphonies. In the symphonies, you are in control almost entirely of the argument and of the pacing and so on, but in the Mahler songs, the text is king, and presumably then the singer is queen.
Yes, and I have to be a bloody good servant. I think that's the answer. No, yeah, the text is paramount. The text is there, but you have to be so at one with the text. And the way I approach songs and, you know, opera and everything else is that you start by just reading the text. You read it so you know how to pronounce it, you know where the inflection is, you know where the comma is. And actually what's interesting is, you know, learning the songs. You know, you do one's preparation, and you meet someone like Magdalena Kožená, who's singing them, and suddenly a comma takes on a completely different world. You know, the way that she is actually singing these songs is remarkable. But it's very different. I mean, in terms of accompanying her, I think the real difficulty with these songs is the style, is the sense of schwung and lift. You know, even if you've got a rung, gung. You know, there's this one where the song Verlorene Muur, which basically when this lady is trying to tempt this young man, and she says, "Come here, my child. You know, come here, laddie. Don't you want to come and see these beautiful lambs?" And by the end, she's offering her heart, and it's in 3/8, and it's basically written rum, bop bum bum, bop bum. So, you know, quaver and semi. And on the page, if you play it exactly, it sounds bum, bop bum bum. But, you know, the whole point is with all this style in Viennese that it must be, you know, this rum, pa pum. I mean, not even that's even too fast, but rum, pa pum, bum, pa pum. All this swung sense, and this, you know, this whole idea of the Viennese. You don't quite know whether they're always, you know, completely telling the truth or whatever it is. You know, there's got to be that kind of oily feel to it as well. And I think finding that style is very hard. But the complete joy is the fact that it's a chamber orchestra, and when one person breathes, you know, you hopefully see this sea of people breathing, and then you can find your way through it. But the text is completely paramount. Yeah.
Well, on that note, in the opera house and in a situation like this where you're working with text, do you almost feel a different part of your brain engaging as a conductor? Do you have to approach the podium in a totally different way? Not necessarily. Well, first, how I approach my own mental awareness towards it. I mean, the fact is, with Brahms, there is this feeling of absolute music. I mean, there isn't a program. There is no known program to the symphony, and it's not that it's more spiritual. It's more this, but there's something. You know, you're not dealing with words and text and something which you can imagine. You know, I can imagine the lambs. I can imagine the lady wooing this man. But with the opening of Brahms 2, what do you imagine? You've got to find what you imagine with the cellos and basses opening out this huge symphony. So that's firstly a different awareness in terms of the way one would approach what's happening in the mind. But definitely in terms of the structure of conducting it, I mean, I have to accompany Magdalena, and with opera you have to also lead but accompany at the same time, and that's very different. I mean, there are all these feelings and movements of energies between conductors and musicians, and there are times when you literally just open up your arms and you invite the player to play, and you let them play, and you give them the space, and then you find them at the downbeat.
And then there are other times when you have to, you know, skewer them to the wall and say, play there, or die. You know, it's the whole of those sort of ramifications about it.
Now you could say that today's concert is very much about the German tradition. Next week is very much about a French tradition.
Yeah.
Was that, well, presumably that you're too bold a programmer for that not to be intentional. Just talk us through a little bit of the kind of difference and the excitement of putting those two programs cheek by jowl.
Yeah, I mean, well, so for the second week, I just wanted to do a Haydn symphony, you know, next week's, I suppose the focus, yes, it is French, but I suppose I started with the feeling I want to do the Haydn symphony for the second week. It's the Clock Symphony, and also we did it on the Highlands tour this summer. And, you know, that's something that, as I carry on, you know, learning all these things, that the idea of repeating things is very important. If I've got 2 weeks back to back with my orchestra, the first 2 weeks, you know, just to have basically 7 completely new pieces for everyone and everything. So it's lovely that we'll be returning to the Haydn. And actually the Foray, the Pelléas and Melisande, this wonderful suite. And I suppose a year and a half ago I started my relationship with the orchestra doing the Foray, Masque et Bergamasque, and the Pavane. And so I wanted to bring that back for my first 2 weeks here. And there's just a little thread through the season of Berlioz. I will do the L'Enfance de Christ in February. And so I wanted to find, you know, the pieces, and I know that the orchestra done Les Nuits d'été quite a lot, and they haven't done La Mort de Cléopâtre, which is what we do next week. And this is a wonderful, wonderful piece. I mean, Cleopatra, you know, what a woman. And it's, you know, finding out about her, finding about the myth, trying to get inside the history from the point of view of the Shakespeare, and reading everything. I love to do that when I prepare scores, to, you know, even if the orchestra doesn't, even if I don't say anything to the orchestra, you know, part of preparation is to infest the body with thoughts and colours and feelings, and the idea of text. And so when I look at the Cleopatra, I want to, when she says that she's the widow of Antony and Caesar, in those 2 lines of the recit, I want to know, God, you know, who were those people? You know, what were they like? How did it affect her? Why is she so tense that she says it's only her beauty that remains? And then there's this incredible moment in the middle where you have this rhythm of this bum, 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 the pits, and this trombone chorale just begins, and it's all sort of enharmonic relationships, so you don't quite know where you are. And she summons up, she says, you know, she says, Pharaohs, Grand Pharaon et Lagide, Pharaohs and Lagides, will you take an unworthy queen, and will you let her rest for eternity in your pyramids? And this idea of, I mean, for me, just that is incredibly exciting. The idea of eternal sleep in these huge tombs and pyramids. And so, sorry, I've gone off on a complete track. I just get excited speaking about it. But right. I mean, that's you know, that was the French idea. So tomorrow, next week, not tomorrow, definitely not tomorrow. Next week there'll be Foray, Berlioz, and Haydn. Yeah.
It's a whole different stream of history, musical history. Well, and actually, just to close, this is obviously a slightly larger orchestra than you took to the Highlands, because you wouldn't really take the extended orchestra to the Highlands. Yeah. You've got your harp and the piano and all the rest of it. But a lot of your work to date has been with symphony orchestras. And then this is as you've alluded to several times in this conversation, this is a very different instrument, and it's got very different qualities and a very different intimate nature. But having spent this week with the orchestra, what's that done to your ears as somebody who's accustomed to, say, 60 to 70 players on the stage? What does that do to a conductor's ears to have to kind of listen in that slightly different way?
I think my first feeling is I hope I would always listen in the same way. I think I'm listening in the same way. It's probably just the response of how you deal with a group. I mean, if you've got 17 first violins and you have to make them play a phrase, there's something about the way in which you lead them, which is very different than if you have 10 or 8. And a lot of it is about enabling the chamber orchestra to shape their own phrase. Because actually, if you bully a chamber orchestra into doing what you have to do with 16 violins, I don't think the effect is so good, because it's such an individual feel and sound that you have to let their energies come out. And so it's just, I think it's more, not maybe to do with ears, but more to do with movements of energy between me and the players. Actually, I read something that Andrew Manzi said, which I loved. He just said, I'm just a musician like them, and that sort of remained with me a bit, actually. You know, it's very much in this case with a chamber orchestra, you know, you were a musician facilitating and leading. Brilliant.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Robin Ticciati.